Hello everyone, welcome to another physical science lesson. Today we're focusing on a very important aspect of science. In fact, it's probably the most important aspect. And you know what? A lot of the thinking that we're going to be covering today comes up in tests and exams. So please make sure that you pay attention and that you learn to apply these skills that we're going to be focusing on. So let's go and see exactly what we're looking at today. We're going to be looking at investigating different types of relationships. And when we mention types of relationships, we're obviously talking about some things that are going to be related to practical investigations. And so the aim of a practical investigation is really to find out how we can relate things together. And within the idea of relationships, we'll then find that we've got different types of relationships. We've got these words directly proportional and inversely proportional that we're going to focus on today. There's also a squared relationship. We'll look at different ways to represent these relationships. We can use words to represent the relationship. We can use a table, and we can analyze the data within the table to try and see if we can see a pattern. The pattern will tell us if there's a relationship. And then, of course, the most important thing is to look at a graph of the relationships. And if we can learn to analyze this information in whatever way it's given to us, we'll have a much better idea of how different variables within an experiment, within a topic of focus that we're looking at in both physics and chemistry relate to each other. So let's start with a question. And the question we're going to say is, how do scientists find out which formula to use to describe their observations? And that's quite an interesting idea. We know that there are a whole lot of formula. In a test or exam, you'll be given a data sheet. Well, where do these formula come from? Do they just pluck them out of the air? Well, actually, no. They very carefully collect data when they're doing experiments, and then based on that data, they are able to come up with a relationship. And the relationship often links to a formula. We perhaps won't go as far as that today, but it's important for us to understand the importance of relationships. So, in terms of what we're going to be doing, let's remind ourselves of some key terms. What is a variable? Well, a variable is something in an experiment that can change. It could be just a very simple thing like temperature, something that we can measure and that in the course of the experiment will change. So it could be time is another example of a variable. Now, in terms of how we're doing the experiment, remember there are two variables that we're going to look at. The one that we control, so if you control the variable and you are allowed to change it, then that is called the independent variable. The one that you don't control, the one that changes because you're changing the independent variable, that is called the dependent variable. So this one is the dependent variable. Now there are also things that stay the same. These are constants. And those ones aren't being measured. We're just keeping them the same to make sure that we've got a fair test. Because you see, a fair test is an experiment in which you only allow two things to change. Because if we allow multiple things to change, then we don't know what's actually causing the effect. That's the problem when we look at big situations, real life situations, where we can't really control all the variables. Then we don't know that there's a direct relationship. So if you look at something like in life sciences, look at the spread of the pandemic as an example, there are many extraneous factors. The word extraneous means unknown factors, other things that could impact, and they're difficult to control. And so we recognize that if we want to be very clear in physical sciences, we have to make sure that we don't allow anything to change that could influence our outcome. And to do that, we have to have an investigative question, a question that focuses our attention on exactly what we're going to be doing. And in terms of that, the investigative question always goes together with the hypothesis. And a hypothesis is an idea that we've got from our observations on how things will work. Now, I want to do a little experiment with you, and I'm going to use a simulation of a pendulum to try and work with it. And so we're going to look at this investigation of swinging a pendulum backwards and forwards, and we're going to say what factors affect the period of the pendulum. In other words, the time it takes to go one cycle backwards and forwards. And I've identified certain variables. It could be the mass of the pendulum. We call that thing that hangs down the bob of the pendulum. So the mass of the bob. If it's heavier, does it make it swing faster or slower? I'm not sure. Well, let's have a look. The length of the string, does that affect? And what about the angle of release? All of these are variables. Now, we can't allow just any old how to investigate them. We recognize these are all variables that we could control. So they would be the idea of an independent variable. And the dependent variable, the outcome, would be the period. So the period is the thing that we're going to be looking as the dependent variable. Now, we're going to, when we do the experiment, we're going to do it one pair at a time. So we'll look at the mass, change the mass a little, see if it has an effect on the period. Then change the length, see if that has an effect. Change the angle, see if that has an effect. And so I want you to look carefully at my hypothesis statements here, because this is something that I want you to think about. You've got the idea of what this experiment is about, but what do you think the outcome could be? Now, guys, this is good scientific thinking. It's about thinking and predicting what will happen. Let's just read the statements. If the mass of the bob increases, what do you think will happen? Will the period increase, stay the same, or decrease? You could say, I have no idea. Well, that's fine, but write down something. Write down what you think the effect will be. That's what a hypothesis is. It relates the independent variable to the dependent variable in some sort of way. After we've done the experiment, we'll be able to come back to our hypothesis and say, were we correct? Was the hypothesis correct, or was it incorrect? That's the beauty of the scientific method. But when you're asked to write a hypothesis, write it in terms of the variables. So again, have a look. What do you think the effect of the length will be? Will it cause the period to increase, stay the same, or decrease? What about the angle? Will it cause it to increase, stay the same, or decrease? Well, you know what? I think we go for a little break. While you're on a break, write down what do you think those variables will cause the change of the period to be. We'll be right back after this break.